Since Italy's election results came out this week, setting up far-right leader Giorgia Meloni to be their next prime minister, a few old videos of her have been getting particular attention. The left's been sharing a clip from 1996 where a very young Meloni praises Mussolini, a sobering warning perhaps of where her politics originated. Meanwhile, the right has been sharing this clip.
Perché tutto quello che ci definisce in questo tempo è un nemico, per chi vorrebbe che non avessimo più un'identità e che fossimo solamente schiavi, consumatori perfetti. E allora è sotto attacco l'identità nazionale, è sotto attacco l'identità religiosa, è sotto attacco l'identità di genere, è sotto attacco l'identità familiare. Non devo potermi definire italiana, cristiana, donna, madre, no. Io devo essere cittadino X, genere X, genitore 1, genitore 2, devo essere un numero. Perché quando sarò solamente un numero, quando non avrò più un'identità, quando non avrò più radici, beh, allora sarò lo schiavo perfetto in balia della grande speculazione finanziaria.
Meloni says Italians, you notice there at the end, are slaves at the mercy of financial speculators. Senator Ted Cruz shared that video. He was among many who shared it, calling it spectacular, which is a bit odd because his wife Heidi could very well be considered a quote-unquote financial speculator, given she's a managing director at investment megabank Goldman Sachs. But I think we all know Ted New York Values Cruz is not talking about Wall Street finance bros, and neither is Meloni. Historian Michael Beschloss deciphered the financial speculators line on Twitter. Quote, sounds just like 1930s in Italy and Germany. No thanks for the memories. And he notes, Mussolini enjoyed publicly referring to Jewish people as financial speculators who needed to be controlled. That's what we're talking about here. It shouldn't surprise any of us that the far-right leader of a party that literally descends from Mussolini's own fascist party is already peddling the same anti-Semitic rhetoric. But it should scare us. Joining me now to discuss this is MSNBC political analyst Peter Beinart. He's the author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack and editor-at-large for Jewish Currents. Peter, thanks for coming back on the show. When we talk about financial speculators, especially as being to blame for all of society's problems, how much does that kind of rhetoric sound like the 1930s to you when it comes from someone like Meloni?
It's very problematic. I mean, and it's really important to make a distinction, right? Bernie Sanders talks about the problem of the global financial system. Talks about income inequality. But when he talks about it, he specifically names the kinds of people who he's talking about. And the people who he names are people who he names because of the particular role they play in the economy, right? Not because they have a relation, not because they're Jews. And he also has an economic agenda that is focused on progressive economic change. What you see with right-wing figures like Meloni and also those in our own country like Donald Trump is that they use this populist economic language, but their policies actually exacerbate the problems of global inequality. And so what they do is they hijack what appears like a left-wing economic agenda, but they give it this sinister cultural valence. So the people, the problem, the financial speculator is not actually a term about a certain economic profession. It's actually a coded way of talking about a certain ethnic or national group, the Jewish people.
Yes, and you remind me by mentioning Trump of that 2016 clothing ad that him and Bannon came up with, where you saw only three faces as the faces of the financial elite, and it was Janet Yellen, Lloyd Blankfein, and George Soros, if memory serves me correctly, all three. I have no idea what they have in common, none whatsoever. Giorgia Meloni, Peter, has espoused this theory of ethnic substitution, too, which is a version of the Great Replacement theory of the far right. People tend to think of Great Replacement as being about stopping black and brown hordes from coming into the West. It's Islamophobic, it's anti-black racist, but it's also anti-Semitic, right?
Yes, and we've talked about this before, because the thing about these racists is they think their countries are threatened by immigrants from the global South, but they also think that immigrants from the global South are inferior and thus essentially can't organize an invasion on their own. And that's where the Jews come in, right? Whether it's George Soros or some figure like that, the idea is that the Jews are secretly organizing these people from the global South to do the invasion. The Jews are the kind of sinister, evil geniuses in the story. Hungary. And that is essentially the story that we've seen all over the world. Now with her in Italy, it was the same kind of story that led this guy in Pittsburgh to ultimately shoot people in the Tree of Life Synagogue, because he decided that the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and George Soros were behind the caravans that were supposedly invading the United States.
Yes. And it's worth reminding our viewers that at the time, then President Donald Trump pretended that maybe Soros was maybe, I'm not sure. I think he said to an interviewer, maybe Soros is behind the caravan. So that was the kind of helpful rhetoric that he added to the equation. So let's talk about Italy. Let's talk about Meloni. She has tried to separate herself from her party's fascist past by disowning fascism verbally, but also by describing herself as a friend of Israel. Peter, we've seen a lot of people on the right, on both sides of the Atlantic, push what sound like anti-Semitic tropes, but then say, hey, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm a big supporter of Israel. We see Viktor Orban in Hungary often hiding behind that defense when he's accused of pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's a common tactic, is it not? Do you buy it?
Well, in fact, there's no ideological contradiction between not liking the Jews in your own country and really liking particularly right-wing Israeli government. So Israel is an ethno-state, right? It's a state built around one particular ethno-religious group. It has an immigration policy which makes it extremely difficult to get a citizenship if you're not Jewish, for instance. It has democratic features too, but but more for Jews certainly than for Palestinians. So Israel is a kind of a model for the far right, whether they be in Hungary or Italy or the United States. The problem with Jews in their own countries is that Jews are not of the dominant ethnic religious group and generally have a really annoying tendency to not want their countries to be Christian nations and to ally with immigrants and other disadvantaged groups in order to pushing a more pluralistic notion of equality under the law. And that's the reason that you see this tendency again and again and again for people who do anti-Semitic things at home to also embrace Israel.
So Meloni is about to become Prime Minister of Italy. The American right has been bending over backwards to praise Meloni, to celebrate her win, whether it's Tom Cotton, whether it's Mike Pompeo offering congratulations, Ted Cruz, as I mentioned, saying her speech was spectacular. What does all this praise for a woman like Meloni tell us about the modern American right?
It tells us that what she wants in Italy is not all that different from what they want in the United States. One of the central global struggles of our time has to do with the notion of citizenship. Is citizenship something that everybody deserves equally if they live in a country and they have the right to immigrate to that country through a process irrespective of their ethnic or religious or racial identity? Or is citizenship the only real citizenship is from people who are of the historically dominant group, racial, religious, or ethnic? And what we've clearly seen with the Republican Party is the Republican Party wants America to be a white Christian nation in which people who are not white, Christian, male, straight, etc., can live here, but need to know their place. And that's really not very different than what you see in Hungary. It's not different than what Meloni wants in Italy. And it's really, in many ways, also not different than what particularly people on the Israeli right want in Israel.